we are now in the performative act itself, and to convey the prize, we have asked our federal counselor to perform this action. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame la professeure. Aujourd'hui, mesdames et messieurs, nous sommes le 8 mai. 74 years ago, it was the end of the Second World War, the beginning of the peace. It's a big symbol, and I'm proud to give you the prize. Congratulations, all the best for the future.
Thank you.
Tout le bon pour le futur. Félicitations.
Well, now, no prize without acceptance of the prize, so now we want to see, first of all, whether Professor Mazzucato accepts the prize, and second, whether she deserved it at all. So we want to hear something from her. Thank you.
Should I give some? So I wanted to do a big group hug, but the men were not accepting of it. There are too many men, not enough women on stage. So first of all, thank you so much, Jean-Pierre, for that wonderful introduction. Antonio for, I don't know, having lobbied to have given me the prize. I'm not sure how the decision was made. To the Swiss Academy of Sciences, and of course, ALLEA, and all of you for being here. I think what I'd like to do in the time I have, in fact, I'll put my timer, is to also make us feel a bit uncomfortable, precisely because, you know, we all heard from the speakers today, and I'm sure in the conference that you'll be having over the next days, that things are not so good. So we need to be wary when new concepts come up, whether it's the entrepreneurial state, whether it's globalization, whether it's missions, that we don't just replace the existing status quo with sexy words that sound great, but they almost just give us an excuse for not really making change and actually bringing the same people to the table to continue talking about things. So I think this, you know, for me, it's such an honor to receive this prize in the name of Madame de Staël, who of course was so oppositional. She wanted to contest the status quo. She wanted to contest even those who called themselves revolutionaries, like Napoleon. And so bringing back values, but also value and how it is co-created and co-shaped, and by who's at the table, even framing, for example, the missions, or even the concept of a green transition, who's at the table really negotiating that, discussing it, what are the words that are being used, what are the contracts in place. I really think this is an opportunity to contest all those different aspects. In Europe, of course, being in a moment of crisis, as we heard, both social, political, economic, but also having such a rich history of solidarity between countries, of bringing us the wonderful innovation, the biggest social innovation, which was the welfare state, which really brought rights. You know, everyone talks about universal basic income, but the welfare state was universal basic services, not a bad idea. It's such a great place to rethink, to really rethink things and make sure that we're doing it in a serious way, which also, you know, with checks and balances in the process itself, not just in what we're talking about in terms of what we're trying to achieve. And, you know, I was very appreciative, of course, that Jean-Pierre mentioned and quoted so much, I feel like I have little to say now, of this notion that we really have to question the vocabulary that's being used. So there's so much talk, you know, in the innovation world about ecosystems of innovation, partnerships, public-private partnerships. But if you speak to any biologist, and I bet there's quite a few perhaps in the room, they will question you to already stop. You know, sorry, what you're talking about, ecosystem? What kind of ecosystem? Predator-prey, symbiotic, mutualistic, what kind? And we, at least in the social sciences, perhaps sometimes are lazy with those kinds of words, or actually maybe in some cases more rigorous, especially if we bring the legal dimension, the institutional dimension, the social dimension to those words. But in the innovation community, in the science and technology community, personally, I think we've become very lazy when we talk about these words. We need to redefine the partnerships. We need to redefine how public and private come together, not just in terms of the contracts, but again, as I said, the vocabulary and really questioning who's at the table. And for this, you know, it's quite important to question, again, how we talk about the economy, and I'm an economist. So again, Jean-Pierre mentioned that, you know, I, like others, have questioned the word the market. What is the market? Is the market the same thing as the private sector? We often hear the market versus the state. No. The market itself is an outcome, it's an outcome of how public and private and third sector, so civil society organizations, come together, but also individually how they are governed. We shouldn't forget, by the way, that the modern day markets were fundamentally shaped also by social movements. Without trade unions, the labor movement, we would not have the weekend. Not a bad social innovation, the 8-hour workday. And those struggles and those movements, not just with trade unions, help to form, to shape, to co-create the modern day market. But of course also public policy, and that's, you know, a lot of the work that I've done over the years has been to show how policy itself, you know, really kind of has been fundamental to getting us the kind of markets we have, which isn't always good. We know, in fact, right? The financial crisis, of course, shows us what market mechanisms can often bring, which is, you know, periodic crises. But questioning the market and how we use the word means also creating less of a lazy narrative in those who also use, for example, the term market forces as an excuse for why, for example, perhaps they are implementing short-termist and speculative policies. As soon as you say, what market forces? They're not out there as some deterministic force, but how you yourself, for example, in a company, do corporate governance itself determines the kind of market outcomes we want. And so in rethinking the market, in rethinking the kind of tools we also need in Europe today to really get to these wonderful challenges that we talk about, which Europe has actually been talking about for many years, the challenge of sustainable growth, inclusive growth, smart innovation-led growth, that is really a frank and explicit admission that growth and innovation have not just a rate, but a direction. But how do we set that direction together in a way that also enables contestation along the way, and not just a top-down process, is, I think, a very important part of this discussion. But let me just come back to this word governance. You know, it's not just corporate governance that's important, it's also governance of the public sector. You know, when we think of innovation spending and science and technology spending, education spending, all sorts of spending by the public sector, this happens through different types of organizations. My work in the entrepreneurial state looked at the different organizations that were important for getting us basically everything that's smart and not stupid inside all our smart products, from the internet, GPS, touchscreen display, Siri, etc. But what do we know about those organizations? What do we know about CERN? What do we know about DARPA and its ability to really welcome exploration, experimentation, trial and error and error and error? What do we know about InQtel, the CIA's public venture capital fund? You might start getting scared when you realize just how powerful the CIA is. It even funded touchscreen display on all our phones. Every time you let your kids touch your phone, ask yourself who funded that. But those organizations, it's quite extraordinary. We have business schools around the world, you know, top business schools that think about really interesting issues about governance in the private sector. Just think of the courses that managers like Francesco Profumo would have taken: strategic management, decision sciences, organizational behavior. There's these wonderful textbooks that come out with these titles like Rejuvenating the Mature Corporation. Why? Because when you have a mature, large, bureaucratic private company, you start worrying, is it going to, you know, remain flexible and adaptable and dynamic and innovative and creative? Well, we need to be careful. So General Motors introduced the multi-divisional form of the company precisely to resist big kind of bureaucratic structures. And yet when we think of the public sector, the word bureaucracy, we have sort of just accepted it as a negative word, right? Instead of questioning how can we make sure we are constantly creating dynamic, creative, sexy bureaucracies that are nimble, flexible, adaptable, able to partner in dynamic ways with different actors in society, we just use the word, oh, that's such a bureaucratic procedure, as though there's something in the DNA of a bureaucracy which will by definition make it more kind of, slow and inertial and lumpy and dinosaurish. And so, one of the things that we're doing in the institute that I set up at UCL, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, has been very much to sort of question that and to create what we hope to be the kind of before and after moment for the Masters in Public Administration, which really brings that live thinking about creating adaptable, flexible, value-creating public organizations and actually train the civil service with an idea that they are actually co-creating value. They're not just there to facilitate, to enable, to de-risk, a word which I'm sure many of us have written if we ever contributed to any white paper or green paper. You're de-risking who? The risk takers. If you're a young graduate, do you want to be a de-risker or a risk taker? We kind of set up our bureaucracies to fail. We don't describe them in ambitious ways, which then also will attract some of the more ambitious, if you want, young people. So, this is a huge problem, and Obama mentioned it once. He had a wonderful quote. He said, we're living in the digital age, but we still have structures in government which are reminiscent of the age of black and white TV. But in order to make those changes, you really need to believe in the role of the public. You need to believe that it can co-create value, because then you will start asking yourself, are the right structures in place to enable it to be a co-creator, as opposed to just a fixer of market or system failures? And that's where I think we should kind of nest this whole concept of missions. Missions should be disrupting fundamentally, not just how we do policy, but how we do organizations, how we organize our instruments of intervention. And the word intervention itself, by the way, is one I don't like, because again, it's reminiscent of the fact you have something out there and you are intervening in it for good or for bad, yeah? So how do you really disrupt that? And there, because it is the 50th anniversary of the moonshot, which was alluded to before, it's a really interesting moment to just kind of pause. And instead of just using the word, the moonshot, we went to the moon and back again, amazing feat of humanity, and I think tomorrow in your sessions you will be reflecting on that, to really ask, do we have the structures in place, let alone the ambition, to go to the moon and to be so, challenge-oriented, mission-oriented? Do we actually have the structures in place in the public sector, but also the public-private relationships that got us to the moon? And I think the answer is no. But I think what's wonderful is, given that this concept of missions and challenge-oriented innovation are really at the fore, not just in Europe, but also it's really taking off, I think, also in places like the UN, but also, as Jean-Pierre mentioned, we've been working on this also with rethinking financial institutions like public banks. How can they be not just handout machines to the businesses or sectors that, yell the loudest for finance? How can they provide patient, long-term, committed finance to those organizations willing to do what? To engage with the public sector in actually achieving really important societal goals. So let me just pause a minute and just reflect, kind of superficially, because of the time at disposal, on just what the moonshot meant. And firstly, yes, it was really inspirational, and I really welcome you, given the 50th anniversary, to look back at Kennedy's speech, because he's kind of like, it's going to cost us a lot of money. He doesn't use the word the deficit, but yes, it's going to go up. But it's okay, because it really matters. It's going to help us, if we structure this properly, to create long-run growth, because science and technology have been critical for fueling long-term growth creation. And also what happens along the way is just as important as achieving it. He really looked at, when he was looking also at some historical examples, just how important actually setting up these dynamic structures were just as important actually getting to the moon. But first of all, in that case, it really was kind of Kennedy and his guys, right? It was pretty top down. And so the first question is, what do we mean by missions today when we're using this in Europe? Who's deciding? Is it the kind of Kennedy top-down, or is it something more like, say, what's happened recently in Germany? It's not a perfect policy, but the Energiewende policy, which you could argue has been kind of a national mission to reduce the carbon footprint of the country, but the legitimacy of that mission, forget, by the way, if it was perfect or not, we all know there's problems with many of these policies, but the legitimacy of bringing that mission to the fore was an outcome of decades of the green movement. And the ability of a politician to harness, to capture, to be in discussion, to empathize, also in terms of the art of listening, with, again, social movements to then formulate missions is, again, something I'm not sure we have the capability to do. So let's think about it. What does Empathy 101 look like in terms of this ability of co-creation? But secondly, it really was a mission that required lots of different sectors. Of course, NASA and the aeronautics element, we know that bit. But it required also, in terms, again, of Jean-Larique's points, lots of different sectors, including nutrition. You couldn't just eat a hamburger, textiles and materials. And so this point of these modern missions today that we're thinking about in Europe and again around the world, that they should be intersectoral through lots of different sectors, interactor, public, private, third sector, interdisciplinary as academics, interdisciplinary, bringing the humanities, the poets, to the table to really formulate these missions in such a way that is as inspirational as can be, is really, really important. And especially moving away from a sectoral policy, if you look at how many countries continue to have sector-based kind of industrial strategies, what does a mission-oriented approach look like at the national level, where you actually formulate missions around the future of mobility, clean growth, aging, that really get all your sectors the opportunity to collaborate in new ways and to really create additionality, making things happen that wouldn't have happened anyway. And there too, I think it's interesting with the Energiewende, it required even the steel industry to reduce its material content. This wasn't just about renewable energy. But third, and this is perhaps the most difficult bit in terms of changing the status quo, the moonshot required really using the power, the full power of government's tentacles in the system, from procurement policy to prize schemes to grants, and I'm thinking also of more modern missions that we've seen since the moonshot, to fulfill a goal. So instead of just having SME policy, small, medium enterprise policy, as though firm size matters, instead of thinking of it in terms of, who's going to produce the lowest cost solution to some problem that the government has, really being able to rediscover and reignite the power of government purchasing, not just government investments on the supply side, but even the purchasing power of government to really fuel the bottom-up experimentation and exploration. So the multiple solutions that might get us, to the moon, there was many different projects, of which, by the way, many failed, right? So again, I wasn't joking when I said trial and error and error and error. And back in 2014, I organized a conference called Mission-Oriented Finance and Innovation. I can't remember what it's called. And I invited about 30 different leaders of mission-oriented organizations from around the world. And one was Cheryl Martin, who was the second director of ARPA-E, which is an equivalent organization of DARPA, but in the Department of Energy, which with a much lower budget, but in theory similar, sister organization. And I asked her, how do you actually organize your organization? How do you organize ARPA? What do you tell the civil servants who are working inside it? What do you, how do you nurture this experimentation, exploration, which we know was so important in the case of the internet, in the DARPA case? And she said something that really has stuck with me. And I was just talking to her about this again a couple weeks ago. She said, we actually measure our success by how much risk we were willing to take and how much economy-wide impact our successes have. So that whole issue of running a public sector institution which actually evaluates itself, am I allowed to drink this? I assume it's for me. No one else has touched it. By how much risk it was willing to take, but also how much economy-wide, so not just tinkering on the edges, its success has, is very interesting. So one of the things we've been doing, and George Dibb is here, who's been helping us with the industrial strategy and revising it around a mission-oriented lens in the UK, is precisely to ask that question, but even to the Treasury. It's the Treasury, in the end, that evaluates these organizations. What does it mean, for example, to let go of, let me just drink it quickly, let go of some of these more static and linear tools that have been used, that continue to be used to evaluate public organizations, like cost-benefit analysis and net present value, and which market failure did you fix, and if you did something else, you're crowding out. Really bringing kind of new tools to the Treasury itself, to the ministries of finance. It once struck me, I actually looked, and I still haven't found it. I'm sure it exists. I hope it exists, because I just can't believe it doesn't. But in the case of the Concorde plane, which is often used as the classic, picking winners problem and failure because it's not flying, well, of course, for the private sector, it's a failure because it's not flying, and so it's a commercial failure. But for the public sector that invested so much money in it, there's been no proper calculation of all the intersectoral investments and spillovers that particular project, forget whether we like it or not, but we should evaluate it, that project had. The spillovers across many different sectors. No evaluation, and yet in the common parlance, it's used as a picking winners and a failure. But this whole issue of evaluation really, really matters, because otherwise we create a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we pretend, for example, that these organizations are just fixing markets and evaluate them in that way, that actually ends up creating the kind of incentive systems inside, literally at the human resource level, of what bureaucrats think they're doing. And the BBC, for me, has always been a very interesting example, because it is evaluated formally every so often, because it's the citizens who fund it through the charter, the television license. And so every time it's evaluated, the same thing happens. And luckily, just because everyone loves the BBC, it somehow survives, notwithstanding this incredibly static process. But what the BBC is often told is, it's okay to make documentaries about giraffes in Africa. It's okay to make a high-quality news, which I'm sure you all watch when you're lonely in your hotel rooms. But soap operas and talk shows, that's for business. And if you do that, you're going to crowd out business and commercial opportunities. And actually, the success of the BBC has been precisely that it didn't view itself in such a narrow way. Okay, this part of the market I can invest in, documentaries and high-quality news, and this bit is for business. It actually has had an internal debate about public value. How do we achieve public value irrespective, literally, of the format? In the television words, the format actually means something, but irrespective of what we're doing, the process through which we're achieving it is trying to achieve this public value. So the kind of soap operas, if you've seen EastEnders, is very different from Dallas and Dynasty, and precisely because they were so cutting edge in thinking about that, they have actually actively co-created and pushed the frontiers of the soap opera market itself, which has then crowded in, welcomed in the private sector eventually to do the same. And this is really important, by the way, for science funding too. One of the examples I often give in my writings is the example of the National Institutes of Health in the US, which spend huge amounts of taxpayer money on pharmaceutical research. And the kind of questions I've asked is, how can it be that then the prices of the drugs do not reflect the billions? Recently, it was 35 billion just last year, I think. I'm actually giving a talk on June 6th to the NIH, kind of getting them to think through some of the questions. But that's sort of, how do you say, an easier question to ask. You ask, all this public money going into pharmaceutical research and the prices are not reflecting that, or the direction of innovation is not reflecting that. But the real question is, why has the National Institute of Health, which has put so much money into that system, not been as ambitious as the BBC in some ways in what it is creating? It's almost all about drugs. It's what a colleague of mine calls the pharmaceuticalization of the health sector. Much, much less proper, kind of hardcore, rigorous research goes into diagnostics, surgical treatments, preventative care, healthy living, redefining lifestyles, healthy lifestyles. So really what the role of a public sector organization, I think, is in this space of co-creating value and co-creating markets is to constantly really be pushing the frontier, being ambitious, and also then having the metrics to evaluate, have you actually been ambitious enough, as Cheryl Martin argued. Let me just finish just to say that I really think this concept of missions should be a collective source of discomfort. Okay, if we, so many stupid things get done in the name of innovation. Some of the most regressive things have been done in the name of innovation. Capital gains tax fell by 50% in 4 years, lobbied for by particular actors who were at the time describing themselves as very important in innovation. The patent box, one of the silliest policies ever, because it reduces the taxation on profits which have been generated by a 20-year monopoly. Yeah, it makes no sense. You've already taken care of, the incentive problem by giving someone a 20-year monopoly profit. You don't have to reduce the tax, was lobbied for in the name of innovation. And we just have to be careful. Again, who's at the table? How are we really co-creating these missions in a way that's not top-down, really thinking through the massive changes we need to make inside public and private organizations. Private organizations, which will no doubt benefit massively also from these new schemes, need to change. We have a record level hoarding rate in Europe, 2 trillion euros being hoarded. We have a record level financialization in the private sector, so $3 trillion have been used just to buy back shares to boost share prices, stock options, and executive pay in the Fortune 500 companies in the last 10 years. What might missions mean for rethinking relationships between public and private? And here it's a really interesting lesson is Bell Labs. Bell Labs, one of the most innovative private sector R&D labs, came about in an era where government was much more confident, and when it was giving AT&T its monopoly status, it was in exchange for reinvesting your profits back into the real economy, back into innovation, and big innovation beyond telecoms. So again, what might we learn from that? I was interested when Sergio Marchionne went to America, Obama, in this rare moment of confidence when Fiat was buying Chrysler, said, okay, but in this country, given that Chrysler was bailed out by the US government, so it was basically in public hands, in this country, you're going to invest in hybrid technology, hybrid engines, because they saw that actually Fiat wasn't doing that in Italy. And Marchionne said, all right, that was part of the deal. So instead of just thinking of missions in terms of a new deal, a green new deal, or a new deal around data, a new deal around climate, literally let's think through the deal. How can we create these more interesting, symbiotic, mutualistic, interesting partnerships? And here, Europe has so much to teach us. We have experiments around Europe, in Scandinavia, but also in the Basque region of Spain, of stakeholder governance, not just shareholder governance. Let's use that. Let's use those as experiments to really help us get the right processes in place. And I'm completely out of time, but I just want to say that it's such a positive agenda, both in terms of the direction of innovation, but really seeing it through in terms of the governance processes, not just of innovation, but of capitalism. I think it's fantastic, and it's what really will set Europe apart from what's currently happening in America and in China. So how great that we can do it together, and how great that you've given me this time and the honor of Madame de Staël, who was, a disruptor. So thank you.